The Smuggled Person's Tale as told to Jackie K. And he had travelled some distance before he arrived at the house. He'd come all the way from the 7th area. He'd come from the Hazara people, Afghanistan. He'd a bad time in Turkey, had caught a boat to Greece, crossed the border to Italy, spent months in Rome. He'd slept under bridges, in train stations, under berths of trains, in the back of lorries. Austria, France, Calais. Christmas 2009. Cold. Very cold. Big snow. The road was near what they called the jungle. He travelled for 7 years and crossed countless borders. He'd taken on different names and had often said he was from Pakistan. You could measure the distance in the look that crossed his face as he crossed the threshold into her house. Moments before, he'd been lost. The street had 2 houses with the same number at opposite ends. He'd been down the other end. It was nothing to him compared to all his journeying. But still, when he first arrived with his story in his rucksack, he was out of breath. He was sweating a little. Tiny beads formed across his forehead. His eyes first searched hers for kindness. It was the thing he always looked for. He could tell right away if people were kind or not. She opened the front door. It was a simple enough thing for her, to open the front door to her home. But to him it was quite something. Over these years of travelling, he'd not often been invited into many homes. Detention rooms, prison cells, hostels on the floors of various churches. Yes, but not into people's houses. He stood in the hall as she went to make a pot of tea. He stood there with Anna, who was already there when he got there, who was the only person in the world who knew what he carried in his bag. Both he and Anna stood quietly, patiently, in the hall, waiting. Only this time, the waiting was nice waiting. This was waiting for something quite simple, a cup of tea. When she finished making the pot of tea, she walked from the kitchen to the hall with 2 steaming mugs in her hand. She was surprised to find them still there, a little embarrassed. "Make yourself at home, please, come in," she said, rushing. She'd expected that they would just go into the living room and sit down, but they'd waited to be polite. As if they had both learnt not to make any assumptions about anything, or to take anything for granted. It made her pause in her own hall and think of all the things she took for granted. The list was already starting to grow in her head. And he sat down in her small living room and he looked around with some excitement. Here he was, G. He was in a house in Chorlton, Manchester, England, the UK. He had made it to the UK. He was safe, he thought. And so was his story. He had it in his green rucksack. He had smuggled it in. The woman was ready to take it. He sat down to get it out of his bag confidently. He was shocked to find it wasn't there. He emptied everything out in a mild panic. It'd been there when he was on the bus. He'd checked. He pulled everything out. Half a sandwich, a pen, some official papers, but his story had gone. His eyes darted from side to side. He started to sweat a little more. "It must have fallen out," he said. "Like my phone the time I was hanging onto the lorry when the roads hurtled past with terrible speed. I heard my phone splinter and crash, and then I heard something run over it. It had everything in it and then was gone." He shrugged his shoulders to indicate that he was used to losing things. He had lost his country, his children, his wife, his farm, The days when he used to farm wheat in Afghanistan were over. It was a strange thing. He'd lost all the big things there were to lose in life. He'd witnessed the death of many friends. One friend had been shot. Another had fallen from the underbelly of the lorry. You didn't have a chance when travelling at that speed. His friend just lost grip and the road took him. Another had disappeared. He had no idea where his mother or father were. He had no way of contacting them. He had lost everything there was to lose, and so it was the small things that got to him, that made him nearly tip over, that made him flip. The mobile phone, the photograph, the small key. One journey had blended with the other. Once, he tried to smuggle himself across a border under the belly of a lorry, and he hadn't made it and had been arrested. It was strange that time. He had gone to the bathroom in the police station and had not recognized his own face. He was another man in the mirror. The soot covered everything. His face, his hands, black. Totally black. It made him gasp. It startled him. His own strange reflection. There was already something of himself that he did not recognize because parts seemed to be falling off. Perhaps they were left on the road too. He laughed out loud at himself in the mirror. It was a shock, and he felt shy to be so filthy. When he came out of the toilet, they let him have a shower. They said, "Don't worry, everyone that comes here from under the lorries is that colour." And they gave him clean clothes. He hadn't expected that. Along the way, sometimes, on life's strange and hard journey, small acts of kindness took his breath away and made his chest hurt. His eyes regularly filled with gratitude, shining and dark. When he came to her house, Jay's, and she opened her door and her face was all smiles, he thought he still had it in his bag. The story was in his bag. He could have sworn it. He couldn't believe what had happened after all the miles and the countries and the crossings, all the borders and hidings, all the smuggled nights and hidden mornings of hunger, thirst and fear, that now it should suddenly be lost. They sat quietly in the living room with all the nice things. And they waited, all three. It was as if they all shared the same breath. Time slowed right down. Time passed in an easy way for him. It was neither the fraught waiting time of detention or the terrifying waiting time of clinging onto a lorry's low-slung belly. It was waiting like a tree might wait for blossom. And it was then that he heard something under the room that all three were sat in. A kind of beating noise. The house, her house, was over 100 years old, she'd said earlier. Under this room was a cellar. It had no natural daylight, Jay said. He got up from the living room. He heard himself saying, "Is it okay?" And Jay nodded, though for the first time that day she looked uncertain. Alone, he crept down the steep stone steps and wove his way through piles of empty suitcases and brimming full black plastic bags, old paint pots and brushes, step ladders, boxes of books and papers. And right in the corner, huddled under the fuse box, was his story. He had no idea how it had got there. He picked it up. It was an injured bird. Its heart beating like its wings used to beat. He held it gently and cooed to it, stroking the feathers in the same direction. He didn't want to frighten it. He was full of wonder. "How did you get out of my bag and change into a bird?" he asked his story. He was shaking. But it wasn't the same shaking. that he'd felt in the prison, or in the detention room, or in the back of a police car, or hidden under the sleeping berth of a train, or holding onto the lorry's underbelly, or locked in the boot of a car to make a getaway. Of all the shaking he had done in his life, this shaking was different. He had found, to his complete surprise, that he was trembling with joy. He called for Jay to come down. He still didn't feel it was quite right to call her by her name, as she didn't feel right to call him by his either. So he shouted, "Hello!" It was a word that could do for everybody. "Hello!" But she didn't come down. She said a funny and shocking thing. She said she was frightened of her cellar. She came to the top of the stone steps and said, "I can't come down, I'm frightened." He said, "I've found it." She said, "Bring it up." And she disappeared from the top of the stone stairs. Goodness me, he thought. How strange. She wouldn't even linger there. She didn't even like looking down into it, her cellar. A space like this was vast to him compared to the tight spots he'd been crammed in on his journeys. Should anyone have ever offered him a cellar such as this, he would have been more than happy. He picked his way through the lines of disinfectant, dishwasher, polish and toilet cleaner, paint stripper and old brushes, and gently carried his injured bird up the steep steps. He felt as if a time had passed between arriving there lost and finding the trembling bird. It was difficult to keep his balance and not drop the injured bird, who clearly had already put its full trust in him and searched his eyes with its own dark, beady eyes. It loved him already. Birds form quick devotions, he thought, in his own tongue, because he couldn't find the words for that in English. When he got to the top of the stairs, he came straight into her kitchen where she'd been making the tea earlier. The kitchen door was open. It was a very sunny day. Can you imagine? After the freezing snow on the journey from Calais, after all the rains and ice and frost, crazily cold in the wrong clothes, here he was, suddenly hot in sunny Manchester. And he had just found his story, which had changed into a bird with a broken wing. "Look," he said, "here it is." And he started to tell Jay, all the time cradling the bird, holding its beating heart to his own. He started with the weather, the big snow he had been through, the slow traffic in the lorries from Calais. He told her of all the winds and all the rains and the snows and the heat, of all the borders he had crossed, of all the places he had hidden. Once, he had hidden amongst all the canisters. Once, he had hidden where he was sure he would be seen and he had not been seen. Yet his friend had been seen and the driver had told the immigration officer there were 2 of them in here. Yet he had not been found that time. It was strange. It was like magic. Like he'd found the power to be invisible. Like he was his own card trick. A human card. Somebody called him that one day. "You're a card." It made him laugh. A lot of things that had happened to him, to be honest, were funny. Laugh out loud hilarious. When he told people his story, it made them gasp and roar in equal measure. They said to him, "You really did that?" They were astonished. That time with the canisters, it seemed he was even able to hide from himself. The man had been in there with his flashlight and had just not seen him. He was excited thinking back to this, how he just got away with it that time, how he just managed to vanish. Or maybe the man had seen him and decided to let him go. Just him, like a single fish, back to water. He thought of how he had been treated in his own country, how the Hazara people were treated, how he never felt safe. In fact, no matter how dangerous these journeys had been, no matter how many crossings, nothing compared to the fear he felt amongst the people who ruled his country. They would just shoot you. One time, in the boot of a car, he was sure they would all be shot. The first layer of his skin had been ripped off in his own country. It is the worst thing in the world when your own country suddenly doesn't feel like your own. When you are cast out from within, when you are made a foreigner on your very own soil. It started to flow. One journey jumbled with the other. The bird trembled in his hands. It is okay, he told his story. It is okay. Out it came, bit by bit, chunk by chunk. He could feel himself lighten. His feet were barely touching Jay's red-tiled kitchen floor. He was embarrassed by everything he had lost in his life, but a smile kept catching the corners of his mouth. He couldn't help it. That last crossing, when he made it against the odds, after many, many attempts, even the police had started to say "you again" when he arrived back at the police station. That last time was something. Even the police had started to pity him in certain places. He was a man on the run from the country, his own country, that was not safe for him anymore. A smile kept breaking, like the early light in the sky, and something actually shifted. It was a mysterious thing. Life. He looked into the eyes of the beautiful brown bird. He didn't know its name, a thrush. It was a song thrush without a song. He was its song. He considered the bird's dark, dark eyes. They were like onyx or jet, moist and deep as the soul of a river. And perhaps because he felt welcome, he could at last take his time. He sat down at the kitchen table, still holding the bird. He held it out to Jay. Take it. Hold it for me a little while so that I can drink a glass of this cold water and eat a piece of this bread. She took it. She took it. He later found out that she was also scared of birds. She had carried it to her back door, and perhaps because the door was already open, it flew through at a strange, lopsided flight, one-winged but full of hope, and made it to the slate roof across the back of the terraced houses, and then to a shared chimney, and then paused as if to say, "Look up here, look at me, here's your story." And then, astonished, he watched it take to the sky. Perhaps it crossed the river Mersey, and perhaps after that it would cross many other rivers. Many rivers to cross before it landed, perhaps back home. Or maybe it was on a day trip somewhere, to Blackpool, or the Lake District, or further north to Scotland, or further again to Shetland. He didn't know where it would travel to anymore. It wasn't his anymore. He had got out the letters and the certificates, the pieces of paper that once made him frightened just to look at his number and name, which had once made him tremble. Just the letterhead, just the words Home Office. He left them on the table for her. He would be elated if he never had to look at those types of paper ever again. Never had the dread of one of those letters clattering through the letterbox. For now, he could leave it behind. And so he did. He left with his bag beautifully light after months and years of carrying the weight around with him. He stepped back into the street, still sunny. He waved goodbye. He promised he would one day return. And then he was gone. Into the still warm day, into the yellow spill of light, into the great good of the day when welcome was all that was in his head now. And the rest of the terror, for the moment, had lifted. What a feeling it was. What a city, Manchester! How kind of brothers! One day, like a carrier pigeon, his story might return with a new message in its mouth. Anna left with him. She was smiling too, smiling like a modest midwife. She was the one person who had helped smuggle his story into the world. Her voice was light and quiet. For months, in the dark, windowless detention centre, that voice had been his lifeline. Every Wednesday, she came to visit and brought him food. He hadn't known how to explain that part. It was like she helped him too much, he said, widening his arms. My heart expanded, he'd said. And now it was something, wasn't it something, to be able to walk together, out of the house and up the street with the red brick houses and the slate roofs, the terrace street with the shared chimneys, the birds lined along the rooftops, to walk with Anna along this quiet street, side by side.